Medicine has always walked a fine line between healing and harm. For every breakthrough that's cured disease or saved a life, there are stories, darker stories, where science crossed a line, where ethics vanished, where human beings became test subjects in experiments so cruel they're almost impossible to believe. This isn't a journey through medical progress. It's a descent into a world where lives were sacrificed in the name of knowledge, where governments, scientists, and institutions turned people into data points. Some of these experiments were carried out under the banner of war, others under the mask of public health, and some, most chilling of all, were done in prestigious universities and quiet laboratories by people who believed they were doing the right thing. But behind their justifications were screams, silence, and scars that never healed. This isn't fiction. This is history. In the next few moments, you'll hear about medical experiments that stripped people of their dignity, their humanity, and often their lives. Not to shock you, but to remind you, real horror doesn't always come with fangs or blood. Sometimes it wears a white coat. If you're drawn to stories that uncover the darkest truths hidden beneath the surface of our history, subscribe. There's more to learn, and even more we must never forget. Let's begin. Nazi experiments, the science of cruelty. The year is 1942. A man shivers violently in a tank of ice water, gasping for air that comes in short, panicked bursts. Around him, men in military uniforms take notes. Some smile. Others simply watch. He's not a volunteer. He's not even a patient. He's a prisoner in Dachau, a concentration camp turned laboratory. And he is not alone. Under Adolf Hitler's regime, medicine was twisted into something monstrous. Science became a servant of ideology, and doctors, once sworn to heal, became instruments of torture. Within the cold stone walls of camps like Dachau, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Ravensbrück, the Hippocratic Oath was discarded, replaced by something darker, obedience to a state obsessed with racial purity, military supremacy, and absolute control. The experiments carried out were not experiments in any scientific sense. They were acts of brutality wrapped in the language of research. At Dachau, SS doctors wanted to know how long German pilots, shot down over the North Sea, could survive in freezing water. So they recreated the scenario, using camp inmates as test subjects. Men were stripped naked and submerged in icy vats. Their temperature was monitored with rectal thermometers. They were left for minutes, then hours. Some were revived in boiling water. Others simply died. Silently, blue-lipped and limp. Every death added another data point to their charts. Other experiments simulated high-altitude conditions. Prisoners were locked in vacuum chambers. The air was slowly removed. Some screamed, clawing at their throats. Others passed out as their lungs collapsed. Observers recorded everything: pulse, breathing, muscle spasms, until the body stopped. And then there was Dr. Josef Mengele, tall, charming, immaculately dressed. Mengele was a paradox. To some, he appeared as a courteous gentleman. To others, especially the children of Auschwitz, he was the devil. He had one obsession: twins. He believed they held the secret to increasing the Aryan birth rate. Twins were taken from their families and placed in special barracks. Each day, Mengele conducted experiments. He would inject chemicals into their eyes to try to change their color. He would deliberately infect one twin with a disease, then kill both, and dissect their bodies to compare their organs. There were no anesthetics, no consent, no purpose beyond delusion. One survivor, a young girl, later recalled how Mengele sewed her and her sister together, back to back, in a crude attempt to create conjoined twins. Their wounds festered. They screamed in pain. Guards beat them into silence. And yet, Mengele smiled. He offered them sweets. He played with their hair. To him, they were not children. They were specimens. The full list of Nazi medical atrocities is nearly endless. Deliberate infections with typhus, tuberculosis, and gangrene. Sterilization experiments using radiation and chemical injections. Bone, muscle, and nerve transplants without anesthesia. Amputations and limb transpositions just to see if the body could adapt. These were not rogue operations. They were sanctioned, funded, and defended. Many of the doctors held advanced degrees. Some taught at prestigious universities. After the war, the world learned the truth. At the Nuremberg doctors' trial, 23 German physicians and administrators were prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The horrors revealed in court stunned the world. And from that reckoning came something important. The Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical guidelines that would shape all future medical research, including the principle of voluntary, informed consent. But justice was incomplete. Some Nazi doctors fled to South America. Others were quietly recruited by the United States and the Soviet Union under secret programs like Operation Paperclip. Their knowledge deemed too valuable to waste, no matter how it was obtained. Thousands of victims, many of them nameless, were buried in shallow graves, forgotten by history. But their pain echoes still, because what happened in those camps wasn't just a crime. It was a warning, a reminder of how fragile the boundary between science and savagery can be, especially when those in power believe that some lives are worth less than others. Unit 731, Anatomy of Atrocity. While the world watched Nazi atrocities unfold in Europe, another nightmare was taking shape in the East. In the vast, bitter plains of northeastern China, near the city of Harbin, the Japanese Imperial Army built a secret compound. From the outside, it looked like a military facility. Guard towers, barbed wire, a railway line for incoming supplies. But inside was a hell unlike anything the world had ever seen. This was Unit 73, a covert biological and chemical warfare research center run by the Kwantung Army of Imperial Japan during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was one of the largest and most horrifying human experimentation programs in modern history. Unit 73 was led by General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant, ambitious doctor with a vision to make Japan the undisputed leader in biological warfare. To do that, he needed data, and for data, he needed test subjects. So, the Japanese army began abducting civilians, men, women, children, the elderly, mostly Chinese, but also Koreans, Russians, Mongolians, and even Allied prisoners of war. Once inside the walls of Unit 73, they were stripped of names and given numbers. The researchers referred to them as maruta, a Japanese word meaning logs, because to them, that's all they were, raw material. The experiments defied belief. Vivisections, the dissection of living humans, were routine. Without anesthesia, prisoners were cut open, so doctors could observe the function of internal organs in real time: beating hearts, breathing lungs, bleeding intestines. Pregnant women were infected with diseases just to see how it affected the fetus. Newborns were experimented on, sometimes murdered, just to examine how diseases progressed through a mother and child. Limbs were amputated, then sewn onto the other side of the body, left arms on right shoulders, legs swapped, veins cut open and reconnected in unnatural ways. And then there were the frostbite experiments. Victims were marched into the snow, barefoot. Water was poured over their arms and legs until they froze solid. Then researchers struck the frozen limbs with sticks to hear the crack of flesh. Some were thawed with hot water, others simply left to die. All of it meticulously recorded. But the most horrifying legacy of Unit 73 lies in its use of biological weapons. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhus. Some were injected directly. Others were exposed through contaminated food or air. When the diseases took hold, the victims were monitored hour by hour, day by day, until death. Then came the field tests. Entire villages were infected. Fleas carrying plague were dropped from planes. Wells were poisoned. Food supplies tainted. In the Chinese city of Ningbo, thousands died from the biological attacks initiated by Unit 73. Entire communities were erased, not by bombs or bullets, but by invisible killers bred in secret labs. Estimates suggest that over 300,000 people died as a result of Unit 73's experiments and biological warfare. The exact number will never be known. And what happened to the perpetrators? Here lies one of the most chilling parts of the story. At the end of the war, the United States secretly negotiated a deal with Unit 73's leaders in exchange for their research data, the results of their monstrous experiments. The U.S. granted immunity to many of those responsible, including Shiro Ishii himself. They were never tried at Nuremberg, never imprisoned, never even publicly named. Many went on to have successful careers in medicine, academia, and government. Justice was buried, just like the victims. Today, there is no graveyard for the souls lost at Unit 73. No international tribunal. No official apology from the Japanese government. Just the ruins of a complex near Harbin, where bones still rise to the surface after rainstorms. And the testimony of a few surviving witnesses, too traumatized to forget. What happened at Unit 73 wasn't just a war crime. It was a deliberate, systematic erasure of humanity in the name of power, progress, and control. The world turned a blind eye then. We must not do the same now. The Tuskegee Study, A Deadly Silence. In 1932, in the rural heart of Alabama, the United States Public Health Service launched what it called a study. It was meant to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men. But behind those official words was something far more insidious, something cruel, something calculated. The project enrolled 600 African American men from Macon County, 399 of them already infected with syphilis, and 201 who were not. Most of them were poor. Many had never been to a doctor before. They were told they had bad blood, a vague local term that covered everything from fatigue to anemia. They were promised free medical care, free meals, and burial insurance. But there was a catch. They would never actually be treated. The doctors in charge knew these men had syphilis. They had the resources to help them, but they chose not to. Not because there wasn't a cure. There was. Penicillin became widely available as an effective treatment in the 1940s. But even then, the doctors decided not to intervene. They wanted to see what happened when the disease was left to run its course. And so they watched. Over the decades, the men's health deteriorated. Some went blind, others lost their sanity. Many died in agony. And still, the doctors kept coming, drawing blood, asking questions, taking notes. They sent nurses into the men's homes to offer fake treatments, placebos, vitamins, or simple checkups, anything to maintain the illusion. The men trusted them. They had no reason not to. But the deceit didn't stop with the patients. Their wives were infected. Some children were born with congenital syphilis. Generations paid the price for a lie buried in paperwork and sealed with a government letterhead. The study continued for 40 years. 40 years of silence. 40 years of slow death and medical betrayal. It only ended in 1972, when a whistleblower leaked the story to the press. Public outrage followed, and finally, the experiment was shut down. But the damage was already done. In 1997, 25 years after the truth came out, President Bill Clinton formally apologized to the survivors and their families. He stood in front of the world and said what the victims had always known. But the U.S. government had betrayed their trust and abandoned their humanity. The Tuskegee study is not just a story about racism in medicine. It's about what happens when people in power believe that certain lives are acceptable to sacrifice. It's about trust, how easily it can be manipulated, and how long it takes to rebuild. For many African Americans, Tuskegee became a symbol of medical betrayal, fueling a legacy of mistrust that still echoes in hospitals and clinics today. Because when healing turns into harm, it takes more than medicine to undo the wound. It takes truth. It takes time. And it takes never forgetting. The Stanford Prison Experiment. The monster within. It didn't happen in a war zone. It didn't happen under a dictatorship. It happened in a quiet university basement, beneath the well-lit halls of Stanford, in the summer of 1971. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo wanted to understand how ordinary people behave in extreme situations. How does power change us? How thin is the line between civilization and cruelty? To find out, he created a prison. Not a real one, but close enough. In the psychology department's basement, walls were converted into cells. Barred doors were installed. Surveillance cameras set up. Volunteers were selected, young, healthy, intelligent college students, 24 of them. By the flip of a coin, they were assigned roles. Half would be guards, half would be prisoners. They all knew it was an experiment. They all knew it wasn't real. But that didn't matter. What followed was a psychological freefall. On the first day, the guards were uncertain, even awkward. They joked, they hesitated. But by the second day, the tone shifted. The guards began to impose control, strictly. Uniforms became armor. Sunglasses became masks. Orders turned into shouting. Humiliation began creeping in. They made prisoners stand for hours, clean toilets with bare hands, perform meaningless, degrading tasks. Sleep was denied. Food was withheld. Rules were invented, bent, broken, then enforced with a smile. The prisoners, meanwhile, began to unravel. Some wept, others refused to eat. One had a full psychological breakdown after just 36 hours. They stopped protesting. They began to believe they were really inmates, helpless, powerless, stripped of their identity. And Zimbardo, the man running the study, didn't intervene. He watched. He recorded. He became the prison superintendent, in name and in attitude. He didn't see students. He saw subjects. The abuse escalated quickly. Too quickly. It didn't take weeks. It took days. By day 6, the experiment was shut down. Not by Zimbardo, but by a graduate student who was horrified by what she saw. She asked the question no one else dared to. What you're doing to these boys, isn't this wrong? And just like that, the illusion shattered. But the truth remained. The Stanford prison experiment became infamous, not because it revealed something new, but because it revealed something deeply familiar. The monster isn't always outside us. Sometimes it lives quietly within, waiting for permission to act. No whips, no guns, just authority, uniforms, and a closed system. That was enough. Zimbardo later admitted that he got too close, that he stopped being a scientist and became part of the system he created. And perhaps that, too, is part of the lesson. How easy it is to lose ourselves when the rules vanish and the walls close in. What happened in that basement wasn't scripted. It was spontaneous. And that's what made it so terrifying. It wasn't a game. It was a mirror. MK Ultra, the mind in chains. In the aftermath of World War II, the world entered a new kind of conflict. Not of bullets, but of shadows. The Cold War. A battle for secrets, for control, and, most disturbingly, for the human mind. At the heart of this psychological arms race was a top-secret CIA program with a name that sounds like science fiction. MK Ultra. It began in the early 1950s. The goal was simple, chilling, and utterly ambitious. To find a way to control human thought. To create truth serums, erase memories, implant new ones. To build the perfect spy or the perfect puppet. And to achieve this, the CIA turned to chemicals. Most notably, LSD. It started with volunteers, agents, scientists, even CIA employees. But quickly, the boundaries blurred. Experiments were conducted without consent, without knowledge. In hospitals, in prisons, in psychiatric wards, in universities. People were dosed with mind-altering substances and left to unravel, while doctors stood by and took notes. Some were kept awake for days. Others were interrogated under the influence. In one case, a mental patient was given LSD every day for 174 days straight. There was no therapy, No follow-up, only observation. Then came the safe houses, apartments in San Francisco and New York, where sex workers, paid by the CIA, lured men to be drugged behind two-way mirrors. It was called Operation Midnight Climax. The CIA watched as these men tripped, confessed, collapsed. They were not suspects, not enemies, just test subjects who never knew they were part of an experiment. The project was sprawling, over 150 known sub-projects involving universities, pharmaceutical companies, and government labs. Most participants had no idea they were working for the CIA. But perhaps the most haunting case was that of Frank Olson, a biochemist working for the Army. Olson was secretly dosed with LSD by his own colleagues during a retreat. Days later, he plunged to his death from a hotel window in New York. The official story was suicide, but his family never believed it. Years later, when his body was exhumed, signs of blunt force trauma were found. Whispers of murder followed. A man silenced, not by madness, but by secrets. By the mid-1970s, MK Ultra began to unravel. A few journalists, a Senate investigation, and the Watergate era reckoning cracked open the vault. Documents were destroyed. Officials dodged questions. The public was stunned. The CIA admitted the program existed, but insisted it had failed, that it was over, that it had all been necessary at the time. But the damage had been done. To minds, to lives, to trust. MK Ultra wasn't just about drugs. It was about power, about how far a government will go when no one is watching, and how fragile the mind becomes when science forgets its soul. We like to think we're in control of our thoughts, that our memories are ours, that our will is untouchable. But MK Ultra asked a terrifying question. What if that's an illusion? Guatemala, infected in secret. Between 1946 and 1948, in a country thousands of miles from Washington, D.C., an American-led medical experiment unfolded in secret. It wasn't in a war zone, it wasn't during a global emergency, it was peacetime. And yet, the cruelty was surgical, deliberate, sanitized in lab reports, hidden behind state seals. The location was Guatemala. The victims, some of the most vulnerable people in society, prisoners, mental hospital patients, soldiers, children in orphanages. They did not know they were part of a study. They did not give consent. They did not understand what was being done to them. They were simply used. The goal of the experiment was to test the effectiveness of penicillin against sexually transmitted infections. But instead of observing natural cases or using animals, U.S. doctors made a decision that still shocks the conscience. They deliberately infected people with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid. Doctors paid sex workers, who had already been infected, to sleep with male prisoners. When that wasn't scientifically reliable enough, they escalated. They began applying the bacteria directly, onto broken skin, into open wounds, and even chillingly through spinal injections. Some victims were infected, but never treated. Others were poorly tracked. Many died. Most never knew why they were sick. The team behind the experiment included Dr. John Cutler, the same man who later worked on the Tuskegee syphilis study, a man who built a career out of watching diseases destroy human bodies. so long as those bodies belonged to the poor, the marginalized, the voiceless. For decades, the study remained buried in archives. No headlines, no hearings, no justice. Then, in 2010, over 60 years later, a historian researching old medical files stumbled upon the records. The documents were undeniable. Photos, notes, internal memos. The story broke. The world was stunned. And this time, there was no room for denial. President Barack Obama called the president of Guatemala to offer an official apology. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called the study clearly unethical. There were investigations, statements, sorrow. But not one person involved was ever held accountable. Not $1 in compensation reached the victims or their families. Many of the subjects had already died, unknown, unnamed, unremembered. The Guatemalan experiments revealed more than a historical crime. They exposed a deep truth about the way power can operate when it hides behind science, and when it sees people, not as patients, but as tools. It's easy to say we didn't know. Harder to ask how many others knew and said nothing. And in that silence, between what was done and what was hidden, thousands suffered. They didn't volunteer. They didn't sign up. They were simply chosen. The present. Ethics on the edge. It would be comforting to believe that these stories belong to the past, that we've learned, that the white coat now stands only for healing, for hope, for help. But history doesn't always stay buried, and the line between care and exploitation still flickers at the edges of modern medicine. Today, we live in a world of astonishing medical power. Gene editing, AI diagnostics, global drug trials. But power without scrutiny always invites temptation. And in the shadows of progress, the old patterns return. Subtler now, harder to see, but no less real. In parts of the developing world, clinical trials are still being run on communities that lack the education or resources to give true informed consent. The promise of a cure, a checkup, or a little money can outweigh the risks they're never fully told about. And sometimes they are given placebo treatments for deadly conditions so a control group can be maintained. In the early 2000s, pharmaceutical giants tested new AIDS drugs on children in African and South American orphanages. Some children were given toxic doses. Others were left untreated. Oversight was minimal. Consent, at best, was a signature on a form in a language no one translated. In India, thousands of women were enrolled in trials for the HPV vaccine, many without being told the study was even happening. Several died. Investigations followed. Accountability did not. And it's not just faraway places. Even in the richest nations, ethical violations still occur. Patients are sometimes enrolled in experimental treatments without real comprehension. Terminally ill people are offered last resort therapies that are more about data collection than dignity. And the tech industry, eager to disrupt healthcare, often bypasses medical ethics entirely, replacing clinical caution with corporate speed. In some hospitals, unconscious patients have had their tissues harvested for genetic studies they never agreed to. In universities, Researchers still face pressure to produce results, even when it means bending ethical lines. And whistleblowers, they still risk everything: careers, reputations, safety, just to say, this isn't right. It no longer takes a war, a dictator, or a secret program for science to go astray. All it takes is ambition without restraint, funding without oversight, or a quiet belief that some people's suffering is a price worth paying for someone else's cure. But that belief has never been true, because behind every breakthrough is a question: at what cost? Real ethics begin not in the lab, but in the acknowledgement of human dignity, in the understanding that no data point is worth a life lived in pain or a death suffered in silence. Today's medicine has the tools to do miracles, but it also has the potential to repeat the worst mistakes in more sophisticated ways. And so we must remain vigilant, not just as patients, but as people, because the ghosts of the past aren't gone. They're watching, waiting to see if we've truly learned, or if we've simply become better at forgetting. The silence between heartbeats. So here we are, at the end of a journey that never should have begun. A journey through rooms without windows, through corridors of silence, through ledgers filled with numbers where names should have been. We've walked through frozen tanks in Dachau, dissecting rooms in Harbin, the dusty fields of Alabama, the prison basements of California, and the whispered halls of the CIA. We've heard the stories no one wanted to tell, because to tell them is to admit what humans are capable of when empathy dies and curiosity becomes conquest. The victims of these experiments didn't volunteer to teach us, but they have. Through their suffering, we were forced to define the word consent. Through their silence, we heard the need for ethical codes. Through their loss, we recognized what it means to value life, not just in theory, but in action. And still, the question lingers: have we learned? Not on paper, not in policy, but in practice. Do we treat the poor, the vulnerable, the forgotten with the same care we reserve for the privileged? Do we question progress when it asks too much of the powerless? Do we stop and ask, not can we, but should we? Because real horror doesn't scream. It signs forms. It files reports. It wears a clean uniform and speaks in technical language. It justifies itself in the name of science. And then it asks you to look away. But we won't. We remember not to dwell on pain, but to protect against its repetition. To remind ourselves that beneath every data point is a person, a body, a name. That the pursuit of knowledge must never come at the cost of humanity. If this story stayed with you, if it made you reflect, question, or feel, consider subscribing. There are more stories to tell, more truths to unearth, more silence that deserves a voice. Because the past doesn't disappear. It waits beneath the surface of progress until someone is brave enough to speak. Let that someone be you.